The limestone blocks that make up the east wall of the old Yankton County Jail were quarried from the river bluffs in 1872. Each block weighs between 200 and 240 pounds. They were set without mortar in the lower courses and fitted so closely that a folded paper cannot be passed between them. The building has been reclassified several times since its construction: county storage, a historical society annex, most recently a section of a museum complex whose archival holdings have not been fully catalogued. The east wall is still standing. What was on the inside face of that wall on the morning of the 15th of October 1876 is a matter of surviving record, partial, contradicted in one detail, and absent from every history of the territory that was written in the century that followed. The Dakota Territory in the autumn of 1876 was still absorbing the consequences of that summer. The Battle of the Greasy Grass, which the American press was calling the Battle of the Little Bighorn, had taken place 4 months earlier. The territorial newspapers were running accounts of military movements, land surveys, and the ongoing negotiations over the Black Hills, which the Sioux had ceded under conditions that the Senate's own correspondence describes as coercive. Yankton, the administrative capital, was a town of roughly 3,000 people organized around the courthouse, the land office, and the river trade. The jail was 2 cells divided by an iron partition, a log-framed roof, and a cast-iron stove. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who is paying attention. What the sheriff's intake log for the 13th of October 1876 records is the detention of a male individual described in the handwriting of the period entry as being of extraordinary height. The log gives the figure as 7 feet and 3 inches. The reason for detention is written as vagrancy, a holding category in Dakota Territory law applied when no other legal classification fit the circumstances. The entry notes that the individual was not intoxicated, not combative, and not known to either of the 2 men listed as witnesses to the intake. The log does not record a name. Whether he gave one and it went unwritten, or whether he gave none, the record does not resolve. It states that food was brought at the evening hour, that it was consumed, that the stove in the cell block was lit, and that the duty officer checked the cell at approximately midnight and found the prisoner awake. The notation at the bottom of the entry, written in a second hand that appears throughout the log as the night deputies, records one additional detail. The prisoner had asked by gesture for chalk. The deputy gave him a piece from the desk supply. In the morning, when the day shift arrived, the east wall of the cell was covered. To understand what that means, to understand why what was found on that wall was significant enough to be recorded, copied, and then methodically removed from the official record over the following decade, you have to understand what the American interior looked like in 1876, and what kinds of men moved through it, and what they carried with them. The decade between 1865 and 1875 had produced one of the most extensive traveling exhibition circuits in American history. The end of the Civil War had released a restless population into the interior, and the combination of new rail lines, reconstructed river trade, and rapidly expanding print culture had created an audience for spectacle at a scale the country had not previously seen. Phineas Taylor Barnum's American Museum, before its destruction by fire in 1865, had employed dozens of individuals under contracts whose terms varied considerably. After the museum's closure, many of those individuals moved to touring companies, wagon shows, and the independent circuits that followed the railroad west. Among the categories of individuals the exhibition industry employed was the category it called giants. The word was promotional and imprecise. What it described in most cases was men and women whose height resulted from what the French neurologist Pierre Marie would not formally describe and name as acromegaly until 1886, a decade after the events in Yankton. In 1876, the mechanism was not understood in clinical terms. What was understood at the practical level of the traveling show was that certain individuals grew to heights the general population did not reach, that the growth often continued into adulthood in ways that caused the bones of the face and hands to enlarge and coarsen, and that audiences paid to see them. The man in the Yankton log fits the physical description. 7 feet and 3 inches, falls within the documented range of individuals who appeared on the Barnum circuit and on the independent exhibition routes of the 1860s and 70s. The notation that he communicated by gesture rather than speech is consistent with what period medical observations record about individuals with advanced pituitary conditions, not because they could not speak, but because the thickening of the facial structures often affected articulation, and because a man moving alone through unfamiliar territory had learned, likely over many years, that gesture carried less risk than speech. He may have been separated from a traveling company somewhere along the freight road west of town. He may have been moving independently for reasons the record does not name. The log does not explain how he came to be on that road, only that he was, and that by the evening of October 13th he was inside the east cell, with a piece of chalk, and several hours before morning. What he drew on that wall was not random. It was not the work of agitation or distress. The day deputy's account, written into the log the following morning, describes what he found in language that is careful and specific, the language of a man recording something he did not have a category for, but understood was worth recording exactly. The day deputy's written account, entered into the intake log on the morning of the 15th, describes what he found on the east wall in 3 distinct categories. The first was a series of geometric shapes arranged in concentric arcs, drawn with a consistency of line that the deputy notes, in his phrasing, could not have been accidental. The second was a set of structural profiles, outlines of enclosures and raised forms, rendered simultaneously from the side and from above, in a manner the deputy compares to the engineering drawings he had seen produced at the Territorial Land Office across the street. The third was a border of measurements, figures and fractions written in chalk along the outer edges of the larger shapes, calibrated to what the deputy read as distances on the ground. The shapes had a referent. The American interior in 1876 was still scattered with the physical remains of what 19th century surveyors called the Mound builders, a civilization or network of civilizations that had constructed earthworks across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys and the upper plains margins over a period spanning more than 2,000 years. The larger complexes ran to enclosures hundreds of feet across, geometric in their precision, oriented to astronomical alignments that subsequent survey work confirmed were deliberate. The foundational documentation of these structures was Ephraim Squier and Edwin Davis's 1848 report for the Smithsonian Institution titled Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley, which catalogued hundreds of sites across the Ohio country and argued from physical evidence that the scale and engineering of the earthworks implied a population and an organizational capacity that the settlement-era press was not prepared to credit. What the drawings on the east wall appeared to show was a specific site, not a generalized pattern, a site drawn by someone who had walked its perimeter, measured it, and rendered it with the spatial understanding of a person who had been inside it. If this investigation has your attention, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more to uncover. Your support makes it possible to bring these buried histories to the surface. The orientation marks in the drawings, and the deputy records these with care, noting his own familiarity with compass bearings from his prior work as a surveyor's assistant, place the site to the northwest of Yankton, in the direction of the Missouri River's upper tributaries, in territory that in October of 1876 was being actively surveyed, platted, and assigned to homestead claims under the terms of the General Preemption Act. The measurements along the margins of the drawings corresponded, at the scale the deputy estimated from the chalk figures, to dimensions consistent with the larger enclosure complexes catalogued in the Squier and Davis survey. The largest single arc, as the deputy rendered it in his copy, described a perimeter of approximately 900 feet. The deputy made copies. He made them on 2 sheets of drafting paper obtained from the land office that morning, and he spent several hours reproducing what he saw on the east wall before the standard operating procedure of whitewashing a vacated cell was carried out. The copies were folded and placed inside the intake log alongside the October 13th entry. Subsequent log entries reference their presence. They remained there for approximately 3 weeks. The intake log for Yankton County survives in the holdings of the South Dakota State Historical Society. It covers the years 1872 through 1881. The October entries for 1876 are intact and legible. The copies of the drawings are not present. The space where they were inserted is visible in the binding. The log was stitched with linen thread, and the relevant signature shows evidence of having been cut and restitched in a different thread weight at a point after the original binding was completed. The log does not record when the drawings were removed, or by whom, or to what destination they were taken. What the record does show is a sequence of events in the weeks that follow. On the 22nd of October, the Yankton Dakotian newspaper carried a 2-sentence item noting that a man of unusual stature had passed through the county and been released without charge. No name is given. On the 4th of November, a letter appears in the Territorial Land Office correspondence. This file is held at the National Archives Regional Facility in Kansas City, from the county sheriff to the Territorial Surveyor General, requesting clarification on the correct procedure for reporting what he calls observations of archaeological character made in the course of law enforcement duties. The Surveyor General's response, if one was written and sent, is not in the file. The man himself is released on the morning of the 15th. The log is clear on that, released without charge in the direction of the river road. He does not appear again in the Yankton County records. He does not appear in the newspaper circuit that tracked traveling exhibition performers through the territorial press. He does not appear in the land office records, the military movement logs, or the river traffic registers for the autumn of 1876. The record closes on him at the gate of the jail. What the record does not close on is the drawings themselves, because the deputy made copies, because the deputy was careful, and because at least one further version of those drawings entered the documentary record in a form that was considerably harder to extract than 2 folded sheets from a jail log. 3 months after the cell was whitewashed, in January of 1877, the deputy filed what the Land Office records classify as a voluntary deposition, an unsolicited written statement submitted without legal compulsion, describing in full what he had observed on the morning of the 15th of October and what his copies of the drawings contained. That deposition was received, stamped, and assigned a file number. The file number appears in the Land Office Register for 1877. The file itself is not in the register's corresponding holdings. The entry stops at the number. What replaced it is a gap of 4 lines left blank in a ledger where every other line carries a corresponding document. The Land Office deposition was not the last document. It was the last document that could be traced through official channels. What survives outside those channels is narrower and older, and in one case was found not in an archive but in a private estate sale in Sioux Falls in 1983. Among a collection of surveying instruments and personal papers belonging to a deputy territorial surveyor who had worked the upper Missouri corridor between 1874 and 1882. Among those papers was a single folded sheet. The fold pattern matches the dimensions of the drafting paper the Yankton Land Office stocked in the 1870s. The sheet carries 2 drawings in graphite, not chalk, graphite, suggesting a careful transcription from an original rather than a direct rendering of a geometric earthwork enclosure with orientation marks along its northern face and a measurement border along its outer arc. The sheet has no identifying notation, no date, no name. The surveyor's estate papers contain no letter or journal entry that references it directly. The sheet is currently held in a private collection. Its owner has permitted examination but not reproduction. What examination shows is that the dimensions recorded in the measurement border, converted to the surveying units of the 1870s, describe an enclosure of approximately 900 feet at its widest arc, consistent with the deputy's account, consistent with the scale of the larger Hopewell tradition earthworks documented in the Ohio country, and located by the orientation marks in the upper drainage of a river system that in the 1870s was being converted to farmland at a rate that erased surface features within a single growing season. Whether that site still exists in any recoverable form, whether it was ploughed under in the 1880s, or whether it persists as a subtle grade change in a field that no survey has examined with that question in mind, the record does not say. The General Land Office survey maps for that corridor, completed between 1878 and 1883, show no earthwork features. That absence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of what the surveyors were instructed to record and what they were not. The east wall of the old Yankton County Jail is still standing. The limestone is unchanged. The interior face, where the chalk drawings were, has been painted over several times since 1876, the most recent coat applied when the building was converted for museum use. The wall holds what it holds. A drawing made in a single night by a man whose name the record declined to preserve, in a language of line and measurements that one careful deputy understood well enough to copy and one careful surveyor understood well enough to keep, and that the official record understood well enough to remove. The chalk is gone, the copies moved through hands that left no full account of where they went. What remains is a gap in a ledger, a folded sheet in a private collection, and a wall that has been painted over but not taken down. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen continue the investigation. Subscribe if you haven't, and I will see you in the next one.